The pen scratched against paper in the back corner of the briefing tent, each stroke deliberate, measured. Captain Morrison's voice droned on about supply routes and casualty projections, but Lieutenant Kira, Sparrow, Thorne wasn't listening. She was calculating fuel consumption rates for an aircraft that officially didn't exist in this theater. Her notebook, worn leather binding cracked from months of desert heat, contained equations that could change everything about this godforsaken operation in the Hindu Kush. The mathematics were beautiful in their precision: thrust vectors, payload ratios, flight envelope parameters for a machine she'd only piloted in classified conditions 3,000 miles from here. Morrison's voice cracked through her concentration like artillery fire. "We need someone who can thread a needle at Mach pointate. Any combat pilots in this room?" His eyes swept the assembled personnel: logistics officers, intelligence analysts, communications specialists. Nobody moved. Kira's pen hovered over a particularly complex calculation involving atmospheric density at 14,000 feet. She knew exactly what Morrison was asking for, and she knew exactly why every other pilot in the region had either been shot down, rotated out, or was currently flying CAP over Kandahar. The silence stretched like a taut wire, 23 personnel in desert camouflage and not one hand raised. Morrison's jaw worked silently as he processed the implications. Outside, the distant thrum of Chinook rotors provided a rhythmic backdrop to what was becoming a crisis briefing. Kira finished her equation, double-checked the math, then quietly closed her notebook. That's when Major Reynolds, sitting 2 rows ahead, turned around. His weathered face carried the kind of skepticism that came from watching too many promising missions turn into body counts. "What about the Air National Guard transfer?" he asked, nodding toward Kira. "Didn't she fly something back stateside?" Morrison's gaze found her. She could see him trying to reconcile what his personnel files told him with what sat before him: a 5'6" woman with prematurely gray temples and calloused hands, scribbling in a notebook like a graduate student. The kind of pilot who got assigned to transport runs and training missions. Safe assignments. Forgettable assignments. "Lieutenant Thorne," Morrison said, his voice carrying that particular military inflection that meant your life was about to get complicated. "What exactly did you fly before this deployment?" Kira set down her pen. Around the tent, conversations died. She could feel 22 pairs of eyes measuring her, calculating her worth in combat effectiveness and survival probability. They saw a woman who kept to herself, who read technical manuals during downtime, who never talked about her previous assignments. They had no idea that 6 months ago, she'd been testing experimental aircraft that could rewrite the rules of air superiority. "Classified platforms, sir," she replied, her voice steady as mountain stone. "But I can thread your needle." The war-torn landscape of Afghanistan stretched endlessly beyond the tent walls, a canvas of rock and sand painted with the shadows of conflict. In her notebook, the equations waited, formulas that could turn the tide of an operation spiraling toward catastrophe. But first, she had to convince a room full of skeptics that sometimes the most dangerous weapon in your arsenal was the one nobody expected. Morrison leaned forward, and Kira knew her quiet war was about to become very loud. The briefing tent fell silent except for the whisper of desert wind against canvas. Morrison's question hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. "What platforms?" Kira measured her words carefully, knowing that military classifications were like landmines. Step wrong and everything exploded. She'd spent 18 months flying aircraft that officially existed only in budget line items buried so deep in Pentagon, accounting that even senators with security clearances couldn't find them. "F-22 variants," she said finally. "Stealth penetration missions over contested airspace." The truth, but not the whole truth. She didn't mention the night sorties over disputed territories where radar signatures vanished like ghosts, or the weapons systems that could paint targets from distances measured in hundreds of miles rather than dozens. Reynolds snorted. "Right, and I flew the space shuttle." Nervous laughter rippled through the assembled personnel. Kira had heard variations of this response her entire career, the reflexive disbelief that came when people encountered capabilities they hadn't imagined. She reached into her cargo pocket and placed something on the folding table beside her notebook. A small titanium pin, unremarkable except to those who knew what it represented. Morrison picked it up, turning it over in his fingers. His expression shifted almost imperceptibly as recognition dawned. The pin bore no obvious markings, just an etched pattern that looked like abstract art unless you understood the code embedded in its geometry. Only 12 people in the Air Force wore that particular piece of metal, and 6 of them were dead. Jesus Christ, Morrison whispered. He'd seen the classified briefings, the after-action reports from operations that never appeared in newspapers. Ghost Squadron, the pilots who flew missions that didn't exist to places that weren't on maps. Staff Sergeant Chen, the intelligence specialist who'd been running casualty projections on her laptop, looked up with sudden interest. Sir, if she's qualified for penetration missions, could she handle the Spearpoint operation? The question carried weight that pressed against everyone in the tent. Spearpoint had been shelved 3 times because no pilot had been deemed capable of executing its requirements. Morrison set the pin down carefully as if it might detonate. The target package requires threading a canyon system with walls separated by less than 60 feet, at night, in weather, with surface-to-air sights active on both ridgelines. He looked directly at Kira. The last pilot we sent to evaluate the route said it was suicide. Kira reopened her notebook, flipping to a page covered with topographical data she'd memorized from intelligence briefs. Her pen moved across the paper, sketching the canyon approach with the precision of someone who'd studied every satellite image, every elevation chart, every wind pattern for the target area. Sugarloaf Canyon, she said without looking up. Approach from bearing 270, use the thermal columns that build up along the eastern wall after sunset. Drop ordnance at grid reference 45,892,145. Egress northeast to avoid the Stinger sites positioned on the southern ridge. The tent went silent again, but this time the quality of silence had changed. It was the silence of professionals recognizing expertise when they encountered it. Chen's laptop screen reflected off her glasses as she pulled up the classified topographical data for the target area. "How did you know about the thermal columns?" she asked quietly. "Because I've been there," Kira replied. "Not physically, that would have been impossible given the security protocols. But she'd flown that approach a dozen times in the most sophisticated flight simulator the military possessed, preparing for missions that never came. Until now." Morrison was studying her with the intensity of a man reassessing everything he thought he understood. The operation that had been deemed impossible was suddenly looking feasible, and the pilot sitting in the back corner of his briefing tent might be the only person in theater capable of executing it. The sound of rotors grew louder outside. Time was running short, and decisions made in the next few minutes would ripple across continents. The rotors belonged to a Black Hawk approaching from the south, its downwash stirring the dust around the briefing tent into miniature cyclones. Through the canvas flaps, Kira could see the aircraft's dark silhouette against the orange sunset, its pilot maintaining a perfect approach angle despite the gusting winds that had been grounding helicopters all afternoon. Professional work. The kind that spoke of thousands of flight hours in situations where precision meant survival. Morrison was already reaching for his encrypted radio when his aide, Sergeant Martinez, pushed through the tent entrance. "Sir, priority message from Bagram. Operation Spearpoint has been green-lighted for immediate execution." Martinez's voice carried the tight control of someone delivering news he knew would reshape everyone's immediate future. "Timeline?" Morrison asked, though his expression suggested he already suspected the answer wouldn't be generous. 1800 hours, sir. Target window opens at 21:45 local." Kira glanced at her watch. 4 hours and 17 minutes to plan, brief, and execute a mission that had stumped senior pilots with twice her official flight time. Around the tent, personnel began shifting with the nervous energy that preceded combat operations. Chen was already pulling up real-time weather data on her laptop, while Reynolds had moved to the communications station and was establishing secure channels to higher command. "What changed?" Morrison asked Martinez quietly, but not quietly enough to escape Kira's attention. She'd learned long ago to listen for the conversations that happened in the spaces between official briefings. "Intelligence intercepts suggest the target is preparing to relocate," Martinez replied. "Tonight might be our only opportunity for the next 6 months." Kira understood immediately. Spearpoint wasn't just another strike mission. It was a decapitation strike against someone important enough to justify risking a pilot and aircraft worth more than most countries' annual defense budgets. The kind of target that, if eliminated, could cascade into strategic shifts across entire regions. Her notebook contained contingency plans for exactly this scenario, calculations she'd performed during the long nights when sleep wouldn't come, and her mind processed the infinite variables of aerial combat. Morrison turned to face her directly. "Lieutenant, I need a straight answer. Can you do this?" The question wasn't just about piloting skills. Spearpoint required threading a needle in three-dimensional space while managing weapon systems, electronic warfare countermeasures, and real-time intelligence updates. It required the kind of spatial awareness that couldn't be taught in flight school and the sort of calm that came only from facing death repeatedly and developing a professional relationship with it. "Sir," Kira said, standing and tucking her notebook into her cargo pocket, "I've been ready for this mission since the day I arrived in theater." Reynolds looked skeptical. "You've studied the approach route." "I've memorized it." She walked to the tactical display board mounted on the tent's support pole and began sketching the canyon system from memory, her movements confident and precise. "Primary approach requires maintaining exactly 58 feet of clearance from the eastern wall to avoid radar detection. Secondary egress route follows the riverbed for 4 miles before turning northeast." Chen's laptop chimed with updated meteorological data. "Wind shear building along the ridgelines," she announced, "gusting to 40 knots above 10,000 feet. Kira nodded, still sketching. "Expected. Thermal differentials create predictable turbulence patterns in canyon systems after sunset." Her pen marked specific coordinates along the route. "The key is using the wind shear instead of fighting it." Outside, the Black Hawk's engines were winding down, and Kira could hear ground crews beginning the rapid preparation sequence that turned routine aircraft into instruments of precision warfare. The hangar squatted against the desert landscape like a metallic beast, its corrugated walls radiating heat even as the Afghan sun began its descent toward the mountains. Inside, beneath banks of fluorescent lights that hummed with electrical persistence, sat an aircraft that officially didn't exist. The F-22R, the R, standing for revised, represented $3 billion of technological evolution wrapped in angular stealth geometry that bent light and radar waves like a magician bending reality. Kira ran her hand along the aircraft's leading edge, feeling the almost organic smoothness of its radar-absorbing composite skin. This wasn't the standard Raptor that pilots trained on at Tyndall Air Force Base. This machine had been modified with systems that pushed the boundaries of what was physically possible in atmospheric flight. Its engines could vector thrust in ways that allowed maneuvers that violated conventional understanding of aerodynamics. Its avionics package could process targeting data faster than human cognition could follow. "She's beautiful, isn't she?" The voice belonged to Technical Sergeant Davies, the crew chief whose weathered hands had been maintaining classified aircraft since before Kira was commissioned. Davies approached with the careful reverence of someone who understood that they were looking at the pinnacle of human engineering achievement. "How's her responsiveness in the control surfaces?" Kira asked. continuing her pre-flight inspection with movements that spoke of intimate familiarity with advanced aircraft systems. "Like a scalpel," Davies replied, "but be careful with the thrust vectoring below 200 feet. The computer can react faster than the airframe can handle in dense air." He handed her a flight helmet modified with display systems that would feed targeting information directly into her visual cortex. "New HUD integration. Takes some getting used to." Kira accepted the helmet, nodding its weight distribution and the additional cooling systems built into its liner. "What's the weapons loadout?" "4 AIM-120s, 2 AIM-9XS, and a single 2,000-pound penetrator warhead." Davies' expression grew serious. "The penetrator is new tech, depleted uranium core with a tungsten jacket. It'll punch through 40 feet of reinforced concrete before detonation." She nodded, processing the implications. A bunker buster of that magnitude meant their target wasn't just personnel. It was a hardened facility containing something valuable enough to justify risking the most advanced interceptor in the Air Force inventory. Her notebook calculations had accounted for this kind of payload, but seeing the actual ordnance hanging beneath the aircraft's weapons bay made the mission's lethality tangible. "Flight time to target?" she asked, beginning the ritual of strapping herself into equipment that would keep her alive in an environment where human biology had no business existing. 47 minutes at cruise, 31 if you push her hard," Davies replied. "But remember, you'll be running silent once you cross into contested airspace. No GPS, no data link, no backup." Kira paused in adjusting her survival vest. Flying without satellite navigation over mountainous terrain at night was like performing surgery while blindfolded. Everything would depend on dead reckoning, visual landmarks, and the kind of intuitive navigation that separated competent pilots from exceptional ones. "What's the weather looking like for the route?" "Cloud ceiling at 12,000, visibility dropping to 3 miles in scattered precipitation." Davies checked his watch. "Storm front moving in from the west. You'll have maybe a 90-minute window before conditions deteriorate completely." The mathematics of the mission were becoming clearer. Limited visibility, challenging terrain, time pressure, and the need to deliver ordnance with surgical precision against a target that expected no attack. It was the kind of operation that military historians would either celebrate as brilliant tactical execution or mourn as a cautionary tale about overreach. Kira settled into the pilot's seat, feeling the aircraft's systems come alive around her like a living entity responding to her presence. The cockpit wrapped around her like a second skin, every surface designed with the obsessive attention to detail that characterized military aviation. Switches and displays positioned exactly where her hands would naturally fall, information systems that fed data to her brain faster than conscious thought could process it. As the engines spooled up, their sound was different from standard Raptors. Deeper, more controlled, the acoustic signature of power plants that had been engineered for silence as much as thrust. "Spear 1, this is Tower," crackled through her helmet comm system. "You are cleared for immediate departure, runway 09. Wind is 270 at 15, gusting to 22. "Tower, Spear 1 copies, departing runway 09. Kira's voice was calm, professional, giving no indication that her heart rate had increased or that her hands had developed the slight tremor that always preceded combat missions. She'd learned to channel that nervous energy into hyper-focused attention to detail. The aircraft rolled forward with surprising smoothness, its stealth coating making it appear to shimmer in the hangar lights like heat mirage. Ground crews stepped back with the choreographed precision of people who understood they were witnessing something significant. As she taxied toward the active runway, Kira caught sight of Morrison standing beside the tower, his silhouette stark against the setting sun. "Spear 1 winds now 280 at 18. You're cleared for takeoff." She advanced the throttles and felt 40,000 pounds of thrust push her back into the ejection seat. The F-22R accelerated with the violent grace of controlled explosion, its engines converting jet fuel into forward momentum with efficiency that bordered on the supernatural. At rotation speed, she pulled back on the stick and felt the aircraft leap away from Earth with the eagerness of something that belonged in sky rather than on ground. Climbing through 5,000 feet, Afghanistan spread below her like a vast geological textbook written in stone and shadow. The Hindu Kush mountains rose ahead, their peaks catching the last light of day in ways that made them appear both beautiful and lethal. Somewhere in those mountains waited a target that intelligence assets had spent months identifying and tracking. Tonight, that target would cease to exist. Spear 1. Contact Overlord on frequency 247.55, Tower instructed. Switching to Overlord. Kira adjusted her radio and immediately heard the controlled chaos of military air traffic control, managing multiple aircraft across hundreds of square miles of contested airspace. Overlord, Spear 1 airborne and en route to Area Lima, she transmitted, using the coded designation for her target zone. Spear 1, Overlord copies. Be advised, SA-15 sites reported active along your route. Recommend altitude adjustment to flight level 280. 28,000 feet would put her above most surface-to-air threats, but would also burn more fuel and extend her flight time. Kira quickly recalculated her approach parameters, her mind processing variables with the mechanical precision that had made her valuable to programs that operated beyond normal military protocols. Overlord, Spear 1 will maintain flight level 280 until initial approach. The sun disappeared behind the mountains, and her war began in earnest. Darkness transformed the cockpit into a universe of glowing displays and soft amber lighting that preserved her night vision while providing essential flight information. At 28,000 feet, the air was thin enough that the engines operated with crystalline efficiency, their thrust curves perfectly matched to the rarefied atmosphere. Below, the mountain peaks appeared as darker shadows against the star-filled sky, a landscape both primordial and hostile. Spear 1, Overlord. We're showing intermittent radar contacts bearing 045, range unknown. Possible hostile air activity in your sector. Kira's hands moved across the weapons console, bringing defensive systems online without conscious thought. The F-22R's radar cross-section was smaller than a Sparrow's, but enemy aircraft equipped with infrared sensors could still detect her heat signature if they positioned themselves correctly. Overlord, any identification on the contacts? Negative identification. Contacts appear to be maintaining patrol pattern at approximately 15,000 feet. She adjusted her flight path slightly north, adding distance from the potential threats while maintaining her approach vector toward the target zone. The aircraft responded to control inputs with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. Every adjustment translated immediately into subtle changes in attitude and heading. This was flying as it was meant to be. Human intelligence merged with mechanical perfection to create capabilities that transcended both. Her helmet display illuminated with navigation waypoints, each one representing a carefully calculated position that would keep her invisible to enemy air defenses while positioning her for the attack run. The route threaded between known SAM sites like a three-dimensional maze designed by military strategists who understood that survival often came down to margins measured in meters and seconds. Approaching Waypoint Alpha, she announced to Overlord, descending to flight level 180 for canyon approach. Spear 1 cleared to descend. Be advised, weather is deteriorating in your target area. Cloud ceiling now at 10,000 and dropping. The weather complications were within acceptable parameters, but they would make the canyon approach significantly more challenging. Kira began her descent, feeling the aircraft respond to the denser air with increased control authority. At 18,000 feet, she was below most commercial airline traffic, but still high enough to avoid small arms fire from ground forces who might be operating in the valley systems below. Her notebook, secured in a zippered pocket of her flight suit, contained contingency calculations for exactly this scenario. Reduced visibility approaches required different entry angles and modified timing for weapons release. The mathematics became more complex when factoring in atmospheric density variations and thermal gradients that could affect ordnance trajectory. 15 minutes to Sugarloaf Canyon, she murmured into her oxygen mask, more for her own timing than for communications protocol. The most dangerous portion of the mission lay ahead, the part where stealth technology and pilot skill would be tested against terrain that offered no margin for error. In the distance, lightning flickered between mountain peaks, illuminating cloud formations that moved like living entities across the landscape. The storm was building faster than weather prediction models had indicated, and Kira knew that her operational window was compressing with each passing minute. Her hands remained steady on the controls as she guided humanity's most advanced fighter aircraft toward a rendezvous with violence. The radar warning receiver stayed silent as Kira descended through 12,000 feet, but she knew that meant nothing in these mountains. Enemy air defenses could remain dormant until the moment they achieved firing solutions, and by then evasive action often came too late. The F-22R's stealth characteristics provided significant protection, but stealth was a probability game, not an absolute shield. Physics could be bent but never broken. Spear 1, Overlord. Updated intelligence indicates possible mobile air defense units in your target area. Recommend extreme caution during attack run. Mobile SAMs were the nightmare scenario for any pilot operating in contested airspace. Unlike fixed installations that could be identified and avoided, mobile systems could relocate between intelligence updates, appearing in locations where no threats were expected to exist. Kira acknowledged the transmission while adjusting her attack profile to account for the additional variables. At 8,000 feet, she could see the canyon mouth approaching through her night vision systems, a dark gash in the mountainside that appeared barely wide enough for an aircraft with a 44-foot wingspan. The F-22R's geometry had been designed for stealth rather than maneuverability, and threading narrow spaces required pilot skills that bordered on the supernatural. Entering Sugarloaf Canyon in 30 seconds, she transmitted to Overlord, knowing that once she committed to the approach, radio communications would become impossible due to terrain masking. She would be alone in three-dimensional space bounded by walls of stone and defended by people who wanted to kill her. The canyon walls rose around her like the ramparts of some ancient fortress built by giants. At 60 feet of clearance on each wingtip, she was flying through a corridor that left no room for error, navigation mistakes, or equipment malfunctions. Her night vision systems painted the canyon walls in stark green detail, showing every ledge and protrusion that could destroy her aircraft in milliseconds. Wind patterns in the canyon were exactly as her calculations had predicted. Thermal columns rising along the eastern wall created updrafts that she could use to reduce power settings and maintain stealth characteristics. The aircraft rode these invisible rivers of heated air like a predator using natural camouflage, its engines operating at reduced output to minimize infrared signature. 2 miles into the canyon, her target acquisition radar detected the facility built into the mountain's eastern face. Concrete and steel construction, partially concealed by natural rock formations, designed to withstand everything except direct hits from precision-guided munitions. Intelligence photographs had shown ventilation shafts and equipment installations that suggested sophisticated operations were conducted inside that mountain. Target acquired, she whispered to herself, beginning the weapons release sequence that would transform her aircraft from reconnaissance platform into instrument of destruction. The 2,000-pound penetrator warhead armed itself with a series of status lights that changed from amber to green, indicating readiness to fulfill its designed purpose. 3 miles from the target, at exactly the coordinates specified in her mission briefing, Kira initiated the attack run that would either eliminate a significant enemy asset or turn her into another casualty statistic in a war that had already claimed too many exceptional pilots. The mathematics of destruction were about to become reality in the Hindu Kush mountains of Afghanistan, and Lieutenant Kira, Sparrow, Thorn was the equation's primary variable. The weapon's release came at precisely the moment her calculations indicated optimal target engagement, 2,000 feet above ground level, aircraft traveling at 412 knots, target bearing 085 degrees relative. The penetrator warhead separated from the aircraft with mechanical precision, its guidance systems immediately acquiring the laser designation point that marked the facility's most vulnerable structural element. Kira felt the aircraft lift slightly as 2,000 pounds of ordnance departed, the sudden weight reduction causing minute changes in flight characteristics that her hands compensated for without conscious thought. She banked hard left, following the egress route she'd memorized, while her helmet display tracked the warhead's progress toward impact, 23 seconds of flight time remaining. The canyon walls blurred past in her peripheral vision as she accelerated through the predetermined escape corridor, her engines now operating at full military power since stealth was less important than speed during egress. Behind her, the penetrator warhead was computing final approach vectors with the relentless logic of silicon and software, adjusting its trajectory for wind, atmospheric density, and the precise angle needed to maximize penetration before detonation. Spear 1, Overlord, we're tracking your ordnance on scope. Impact in 15 seconds. Kira was already 3 miles from the target when the mountain lit up with the brilliance of a miniature sun. The explosion, when it came, was felt more than heard, a deep subsonic rumble that resonated through the aircraft's structure and into her bones. Her rearview mirror showed a column of fire and debris erupting from the mountain's face, the facility's destruction both complete and spectacular. Overlord Spear 1, target destroyed, proceeding to egress waypoint Charlie. Outstanding work Spear 1, return to base for debrief. But as she cleared the canyon system and began her climb back to cruising altitude, Kira's radar warning receiver suddenly came alive with multiple threat indicators. Surface-to-air missile sites that had remained dormant during her approach were now fully active, their acquisition radars painting her aircraft with electronic attention that felt almost physical in its intensity. Overlord Spear 1, multiple SAM sites active. I'm spiked by at least 3 different systems. Spear 1, evade south and climb. We're scrambling escort aircraft to assist with egress. South meant flying directly over known enemy positions, but it also offered the quickest route to friendly airspace. Kira banked the aircraft into a climbing turn, her engines roaring at maximum thrust as she traded stealth for speed. The F-22R's thrust vectoring nozzles adjusted continuously, optimizing performance for the escape trajectory that would either deliver her safely home or turn her into another classified casualty report. At 15,000 feet, climbing through thin air that offered little resistance to her aircraft's passage, she could see tracer fire rising from valley positions below, small arms and heavy machine guns firing at a target they couldn't possibly hit, but shooting anyway because that's what infantry did when aircraft appeared overhead. The display was both beautiful and deadly, streams of light rising toward her like angry meteors seeking revenge. Her radar warning receiver's tone shifted to a more urgent frequency. Overlord Spear 1, I'm being targeted by fire control radar. Recommend immediate defensive action. The war had suddenly become personal, and Lieutenant Kira Thorn was flying humanity's most advanced fighter aircraft through a gauntlet of enemy air defenses that wanted nothing more than to add her name to their list of confirmed kills. Distance to friendly airspace, 47 miles and closing. The first missile launch appeared on her threat display as a red triangle accelerating from the valley floor with the deadly purpose of a mechanical predator. SA 15 Gauntlet surface-to-air system with a range envelope that extended to nearly 40,000 feet and guidance systems sophisticated enough to track stealth aircraft under optimal conditions. Kira had studied the technical specifications of Soviet-era air defense systems until she could recite their performance parameters from memory. "Missile launch detected," she announced to Overlord, her voice maintaining professional calm despite the surge of adrenaline that sharpened her awareness to supernatural clarity. "Deploying countermeasures." Her thumb found the chaff and flare release button, sending clouds of metallic strips and thermal decoys into the night sky behind her aircraft. The countermeasures bloomed like deadly fireworks, each element designed to confuse enemy guidance systems and redirect incoming threats away from their intended target. The F-22R's electronic warfare suite added to the confusion by broadcasting false radar returns that made one aircraft appear to be several. The missile's trajectory appeared as a climbing arc on her display, its seeker head trying to distinguish between genuine aircraft signatures and the electronic phantoms created by her defensive systems. For 12 seconds that felt like hours, the missile maintained pursuit, its rocket motor burning through the thin air with visible determination. Then it lost luck. The missile curved away toward a false target created by her electronic countermeasures, its warhead detonating harmlessly 3 miles behind her aircraft. On her threat display, the explosion appeared as a brief flash, significant only as confirmation that enemy air defenses were operating with lethal intent. Overlord Spear 1, first missile defeated, continuing egress. Copy, Spear 1. We show 2 additional launches from different positions. Escort aircraft are inbound to your location. 2 more red triangles appeared on her display, launching from positions that suggested coordinated air defense coverage designed specifically to engage aircraft following her escape route. The enemy commanders had anticipated this exact scenario and positioned their assets accordingly. Professional work by opponents who understood modern air warfare. Kira pushed the throttles forward into afterburner range, feeling the F-22R respond with acceleration that pressed her into the ejection seat with nearly 4 times the force of gravity. The aircraft's speed increased through 600 knots as she climbed toward the missile engagement ceiling, using altitude and velocity to complicate the targeting solutions of weapons systems trying to intercept her. At 25,000 feet, traveling at nearly 700 knots, she was approaching the performance envelope where her aircraft's advantages became most pronounced. The missiles pursuing her were designed for engaging conventional aircraft operating at standard speeds and altitudes. Against an F-22R being flown by a pilot who understood its capabilities, those same weapons became exercises in expensive futility. The second missile lost guidance at 18,000 feet, its seeker head confused by the combination of countermeasures and the aircraft's minimal radar cross-section. The third continued tracking for nearly 30 seconds before its rocket motor burned out, and it fell back toward the mountains like a defeated mechanical bird. Overlord, all threats defeated. Spear 1 is clear and heading home. As friendly airspace approached, Kira allowed herself a moment to process what had just occurred. The target had been eliminated with surgical precision, and she'd successfully evaded enemy air defenses that had been specifically positioned to prevent exactly her kind of mission. In her flight suit pocket, her notebook contained calculations that had proven accurate under combat conditions. But she also knew that success in military aviation was measured not just by mission completion, but by the ability to repeat successful operations consistently. Tonight had been perfect execution. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Bagram Air Base appeared through the darkness as a constellation of lights arranged with military precision across the desert floor. Runway lighting systems traced geometric patterns that guided aircraft home from missions that officially never happened, while control towers maintained radio watch over airspace where the boundaries between success and failure were measured in feet and seconds rather than miles and minutes. Bagram Tower, Spear 1 requesting immediate landing. Emergency fuel state. Kira's fuel gauges showed reserves that were lower than optimal but within acceptable parameters for a successful landing. The emergency declaration would clear traffic and expedite her approach sequence. Spear 1, Bagram Tower. You are cleared direct to runway 21, wind 090 at 12 knots. Emergency equipment is standing by. She could see the crashed trucks positioning themselves along the runway perimeter, their crews prepared for scenarios where aircraft returned from combat missions with damage that became apparent only during landing attempts. The F-22R felt solid beneath her hands, its control responses normal despite having just operated in conditions that pushed both machine and pilot to their operational limits. Final approach required the same precision that had characterized the entire mission, airspeed controlled within narrow margins, descent rate optimized for the aircraft's weight and configuration, touchdown point calculated to maximize runway available for rollout. As the main landing gear contacted concrete with a controlled impact that spoke of thousands of similar landings, Kira felt the familiar satisfaction of successful mission completion. Spear 1 is down and safe, she transmitted, beginning the post-flight shutdown sequence that would secure the aircraft's classified systems and prepare it for maintenance inspection. The ground crew that approached her aircraft moved with the efficient professionalism of personnel who understood they were handling equipment, worth more than most nations' gross domestic products. Each technician carried security clearances that had required background investigations extending back to childhood, and their expertise represented decades of specialized training in maintaining systems that existed at the intersection of physics and classified technology. Technical Sergeant Davies appeared at her cockpit as she completed the shutdown checklist, his expression combining relief at her safe return with curiosity about mission results. "How did she handle in the canyon?" he asked, beginning his own inspection of systems that had just operated under combat conditions. "Like you said," Kira replied, removing her helmet and feeling the desert air cool against her sweat-dampened hair. "Surgical precision." She climbed down from the cockpit, her legs slightly unsteady after hours of high-G maneuvering and adrenaline management. "The thrust vectoring saved my life twice during the egress." Davies nodded with satisfaction. "Target eliminated." "Completely." Kira retrieved her notebook from the flight suit pocket, its pages now containing additional calculations and observations from the mission that would inform future operations. Intelligence was accurate about the facility's construction. The penetrator performed exactly as specified. Captain Morrison approached across the tarmac, his stride carrying the purposeful energy of someone who'd been monitoring communications channels throughout her flight. "Lieutenant Thorne, outstanding execution. Overlord reports the target was eliminated with textbook precision." She accepted the compliment with a brief nod, already processing lessons learned from the mission and considering how they might apply to future operations. Military aviation was an iterative process. Each mission provided data that improved subsequent missions, assuming the pilot survived to apply that knowledge. "Sir, request permission to complete post-flight documentation and submit after-action reports." Morrison's expression suggested he had additional matters to discuss, but protocol required completing operational paperwork before mission debrief sessions. "Granted. Report to my office at 0800 tomorrow for full debrief." As the ground crew began securing the aircraft for post-mission maintenance, Kira walked toward the operations building, her notebook containing secrets that could reshape air warfare doctrine. The night's work was complete, but she knew that exceptional performance often led to increasingly difficult assignments. The debrief room smelled of coffee and the particular staleness that accumulated in spaces where classified conversations occurred at all hours. Morrison sat across from her, at a metal table scarred by years of hard use, while two personnel she didn't recognize occupied chairs positioned with the careful geometry that suggested intelligence specialists. The kind of people who appeared after successful missions to extract lessons learned and identify capabilities that could be replicated. Lieutenant, before we begin the official debrief, I want to discuss your background, Morrison said, opening a file folder that was thicker than standard personnel records.